Rakita.
I'm Sanvi, and today we're going to talk to you about flowing. Flowing is really helpful in debate and keeping track of everyone's arguments, your opponents, and making sure that you get to everything on time and make sure you don't miss anything. Some things that you may need while flowing are a long piece of paper, preferably not printer paper, because you want to make sure that you can get everyone's arguments down. You never know how many arguments somebody will have and how much space you need. So long pieces of paper, like flow paper, is pretty important. You'll probably also need two pens, like preferably two different colors, so that you can keep track of whose arguments are whose. You can color them differently. Um, and make sure that your pens are actually working. You don't have to like change pens in the middle of your in the middle of like in mid speech. That would be a bad idea. And I like ballpoint pens personally, so those are pretty good
And
pens.
adding on to the paper thing, this is like a normal piece of flow paper. It's a lot longer than normal piece, and it's like a normal piece of paper. There's a big difference in size. So like when you're flowing it, you need to make sure that you're using like the right size of paper, so that like you're able to like write down all your arguments effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, something else that you might need is like a short list of abbreviations that you're not copying down every word for word. Some abbreviations that I like to use is like an exclamation point for impact, or S in a circle for solvency, or L in a circle for link. Just makes it so much easier for me to flow because instead of writing out the entire word impact, I can just put an exclamation point and move on. And it's also pretty convenient because if I do want to say like, oh, if the argument is no impact, I can just like put a slash through it. So like coming up with like a good list of abbreviations that makes flowing a lot more efficient beforehand will definitely help you flow faster and make sure that you don't miss anything.
Yeah, so when you're flowing, essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to get like your own little sense of notes for your arguments and what you want to say next. The basic way to flow is that you have your argument and then you skip a line, you go slash slash author in your year. For example, here on the flow, I have no impact. I have Einstein 14. Don't know if that's a real author. So what you do is you divide your flow paper into the amount of columns or how many speeches you have in this round. For example, in policy you have 8 speeches, so I just add a column somewhere in the middle for 8 columns. Either you would fold your paper or you would draw lines. I recommend drawing lines so your paper doesn't get all wrinkly halfway through the round. That gets really annoying. And you would need multiple sheets of paper for an event like policy or LD because you have different off cases. For example, the AF case, they have one piece of flow paper, but if you're running an off case like a DA or a counterpoint, something on the negative side, then that'd be an additional sheet of paper. So this is just one normal piece of flow paper I drew out. So what you do is for the 1AC, you start and you write down the argument. Let's say it says situation is bad now slash slash author year. You use 3 fingers. It's a 3 finger rule. So every single time you write an argument, you put your 3 fingers underneath it, and then you start writing your argument on beneath it. It gives you space to write something else additionally. If you need to add something, add a cross expression, whatever you might need to. So you'd space out your arguments, and that's essentially what you're doing. For the next speech, usually it starts in the later constructive, and for all rebuttals, you have overviews. And it's always a good idea to start your overviews at the top of your flow paper. That's what the O/V sign means. So at the top of each of your columns, you always leave 3 finger space for an overview that you can write down when the other person is speaking. Then after that, you just continue writing your normal argument author year throughout the flow. And let's say this one person is extending this argument throughout their entire case, throughout the entirety of the debate. They have no impact in all their speeches and they just keep saying it. Rather than writing down no impact Einstein 14 for each and every one of those columns, you can just draw an arrow across. So when you do that, it's like this argument was said throughout the entire speech, but all you have to do is like draw one arrow. So it becomes a lot easier to do that. And yeah.
Yeah, another good tip when you're flowing is probably to number your opponent's arguments. It makes it a lot easier for like you to visualize how many arguments you have to get through in like a certain period of time, but also while you are speaking, you can refer back to them as like like their first argument, their second argument, their fifth argument, right? It makes it easier for the judge. The judge wants to line up your argument, your answers to their arguments, like right next to where the arguments were made, and numbering it makes it so much easier. Even if the other team has not numbered it, if you number it, it could earn you better speaks. As well as for example, if the 1 and C had like 6 arguments on case, and your 2AC just like, okay, off of 1 and C number 1, their first argument was this. Then off of 1 and C number 2, their second argument was this, right? like it makes it a lot easier for not only you to make sure that you get through everything, is make sure that you answer everything. Also easier for the judge to flow as well. You want to make the judge's life easier. You want to make your life easier. You should number it. Also, while you are flowing, if you do realize that you are behind in flowing, for example, like let's say there are already 2 arguments ahead of you, feel free to just leave a large amount of space and ask and clarify and cross-check what those arguments were. You make sure, like it may look, you may think that it may look bad asking for like missed arguments and cross-checks, but in reality, it's better to have, like, it's better not to miss these arguments other than to like save face. So definitely, like if you are behind and flowing, just move straight on to like where the person who's speaking is at right now, rather than just like trying to catch up. You can always clarify later. Also, while you're flowing, make sure you earflow. I know in a lot of these events, people do send out files with cards, but sometimes they do leave out analytics, and you can lose rounds if you don't answer these analytics. So it's really important that you know go out there and you make sure that even though you are paying attention to the cards being read in the document and making sure that what cards are being read where, it's also important to know like where each analytic is, what the analytics are, like key arguments and stuff like that. You don't so that like your flowing is much more important than just reading through the document.
Yeah, and just to add on, for analytics, you're probably going to do the same thing as writing an argument, except that you won't have an author here unless it is given to you. An important thing that Flowing can actually show you is whether an analytic actually has a warrant or not. So when you're writing, it can be like, oh, well, this they didn't really provide any evidence for this. It's just like a line. Like that's something like Flowing shows you. So like you should be writing down like all your analytics regardless. You should always paper flow as well. On laptops, you would just be, I know a lot of people end up just like copy and pasting tags from cards and like authors and everything. You don't actually register what the person is saying. You don't really know what's happening in the round if you're just copy and pasting things into your spreadsheet. That's why paper flowing is also better. It also helps you remember things just in case you forget to write something down or forget to say something in a round. You can just be like, oh, like they said that one thing. I remember hearing that. Things like that are very helpful during rounds. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also a lot more efficient. Like if you do need to refer back to your flow during your speech, like mid-speech while you are talking, it's much more efficient to just look at a piece of paper that you have right next to you rather than to switch tabs and try to find your flow in the middle of the speech. It can make things a little disorganized, or if you lose your original file, it's just like a whole like chaotic mess, right? You don't want that to happen in the middle of your speech. Laptop flowing is good if you're at the point where you know how to flow pretty well. Like if you're at the point where you can flow really well on the laptop, then that's great. But I would recommend like starting off on paper rather than on laptop, just because it's so much easier to organize. It's also easier to like write down things. Like your abbreviations are probably harder to put on a laptop than they are, on paper. So yeah.
Yeah, like so. I mean, I've been debating for a few years. Like, I've never once like used my laptop to flow, unless like in a round, unless like I was just trying it out for fun. Like, there's absolutely no reason you should be using your laptop unless you need to.
There's like not that many disadvantages. There's like not that many advantages to using your laptop as there are to disadvantages. So we would recommend just like your using using paper. Another thing that I don't know if one address is how to. Oh wait, no. Archita did cover this. Extending arguments. Yeah.
Yeah, as long as you just draw an arrow across your page, it's pretty much extending the argument. And then, like, when you're getting up to give your speech, for example, let's say you're preparing, like, okay, I have to give a speech next. Like, what am I supposed to do? You can write this all down on your flow, essentially. Like, flowing helps you not need, like, as much evidence, right? So let's say you're the affirmative in this case, and you have some arguments written down. Like, let's say this is your argument. I'm just trying to draw a line for right now. And they say this. However, this card right here responds to that argument. You don't really need a new card for that. What you can do is you can just draw a line and put that here. That gives you a signal that when you're reading through your flow during your speech, you know that, oh, I have to go back and I have to extend this argument into my 2AC from my 1AC that responds to this. Then you can be like, oh, like 1NC number 2, they said this, but here's my response from the 1AC. Extending arguments like this can be very effective, and they save you a lot of time in your speeches. Anything else to add on?
Well, yeah, I think we pretty much covered most of it. Just key takeaways are just to make sure that you are keeping track of everything that the other person's saying. Don't get bogged down by flowing to the point where you're just not listening. You still want to like be listening to what the person is saying. You just want to make sure you're organized while flowing, because if you do have a messy flow, it can get hard to interpret, and that's just that's just like, you know, you might lose in a couple rounds if your flows are just not complete. I know I struggle a lot with this. Like I still struggle with it a little bit. It's just like I end up like stop flowing like in the middle of rounds just because I want to like write my speeches. Just know that like you will have downtime while flowing if people are reading long cards. You will have that time to organize your thoughts. So make sure that even if you like know what your answer to a certain argument is going to be in the moment, just continue flowing because you don't want to miss another argument just because you're trying to find an answer for like the one that they just read, right? But make sure that um, you know what's going on in the round. Just be aware, uh, right? Like make sure you have like some sort of logical organization to your flowing so that it's just easy for you to interpret and get used to flowing before you go to a tournament. Like I would recommend doing a lot of like a couple practice debates or like at least a couple like practice drills, just flowing like different rounds. You never know how like especially if someone's gonna like if it's your first tournament and you're going and if it's your first tournament and you're going like LD or policy, you never know like who you're up against. Like you could be up against like somebody who's been debating for a couple years and knows how to like talk really fast. Make sure that you get used to that before and you go to the tournament and stuff like that. It may seem strange at first, but flowing is probably one of the most helpful things you can do during a round. I don't know if I've ever actually like done well in a round without having me or somebody else, like one of my teammates, flow.
We should always be having don't ever rely on your teammates to flow for you. Always have your own flow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And especially if you're doing a partner event, it could be helpful if the partner is giving like a 1AR or like a rebuttal, to flow for them so that, they have something to refer back to later on. Because like you can't flow while speaking. That's kind of hard. So make sure, just be proactive. Make sure you just be aware of everything that's going on in the round. Don't get intimidated by like, the volume of arguments. Just make sure that as long as you have everything down and and you have everything in an organized manner, you should probably be like pretty like well set to, do well in the round.
And can I just add on that, like, judges can tell when you're not flowing. Like, they're not dumb. They've judged, like, many, many rounds before yours. Like, if you're just sitting there, like, on your laptop pulling cards while the other person is speaking and you're not flowing, a judge will take that into account, and that will affect your speaker points in most rounds. So just make sure you are flowing. It does help you, and it's just for your own benefit, and you want to do well in the round. And I guess to, like, just recap overall, you want to use abbreviations to save time because people do speak fast in rounds. You want to use this format of argument, skip a line, author, year, and you always want to divide your paper up. You want to use like these. You want to make sure you label your speeches and everything. If it comes to a point where you have too many arguments to fit on a page, you just flip it over vertically, and then you can just keep writing. And I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Just make sure you catch down the most important stuff that the person's saying. You don't have to write down everything. Make sure your flows aren't too dense to the point where you just can't interpret it like on the fly. Like if somebody is reading a really long analytic block, right? And then you probably don't want to be writing it down word for word on your flow. You can, based on the person's tone and inflection, you can sort of decipher what the key points are, like important keywords, and using that, it's a better way of flowing, right? So you want to make sure everything's organized,
Yeah, like in flowing, you're not writing down like notes from your history textbook. You're writing down something someone is saying at a very like increased pace. Like you have to be able to keep up with what they're saying. That's very difficult. And there are just some key like things to do. Like once again, abbreviations. Just write down things very briefly enough to the point where only you can understand your flows. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.